We began last week in the book of Philippians with a new sermon series, and I want you to return there this morning as we look at a few more verses from chapter 1. I don't know if I got a chance to say this last week when we began this series, but I really think that Philippians is probably my favorite book in all the Bible. I love the book for lots of different reasons, but there's just so many wonderful things in the book. And of course, as I mentioned to you before, the idea of joy plays a huge role in this book as Paul writes to this church. Last week we talked about teen joy. This morning we're going to talk a little bit about the joy that comes from pure motives or true motives. And we're going to be looking at verses 7 through 18 in just a moment. Some years ago, I guess probably now, I came across a statement where someone said, generally, a person has two reasons for doing something. One reason that sounds good, and then one reason that's the real one. Now, when I read that, I didn't like it because it reminded me of an instance in my own life when that was exactly the case. In my first full-time youth ministry in Tennessee, I remember sharing with one of the leaders in the church why I had made a particular purchase. Now, it was of no consequence or substance necessarily that I told him this, but, I'm just espousing all these wonderful reasons, at least in my own thinking, of why I made this particular purchase. And I wanted to make myself look as good as possible, as we all do. And I went through a long line of things. I bought it for this reason and this reason and this reason. And finally, when I got down to the very end, I added on, and I really liked this one. And he looked at me and he said, I wondered when you were going to get around to the real reason. Yeah. Ouch, ouch, ouch. And then I came across this statement, like I say, some years later, and I realized that, it may have been more insightful than I cared to admit. There's a word that floats around now in certain writings, and that most of us don't come across it on a daily basis. I do, however, because of some of my reading. But the word is disinterestedness. Disinterestedness. Now, you hear that word or you see it and you think it means uninterested, but that's not what it means. The word disinterestedness means doing something with selfless motives. Doing something with selfless motives. And I would question all of us this morning as we think about this. Can we ever truly do something with completely sincere and selfless motives? Is it possible that anything that we do, we can eliminate ourselves when we're making the decision? As a matter of fact, I suspect that many of us, the first time we hear of some information, we wonder, first of all, how it's going to affect us. What does this mean to me? What does this mean for me? How am I going to deal with it? How am I going to process it? Am I going to benefit from it or not? That kind of thing. And so I wonder, can we filter out our interest out of a particular situation and operate completely benevolently toward others with genuine, true motives? Now, the Bible talks a lot about motives. And when I started researching this, I found three scriptures, and I want to share these scriptures with you before we get to Philippians. And these three scriptures, if you write them down and you learn the verses and everything, at some point in time you may be asked to lead a Bible study. They'll make a wonderful study. Okay, they're all about motives. And the first one comes from 1 Chronicles chapter 28 and verse 9. It is the occasion where David is near death, and he is passing along information to his son Solomon. And here's what he says to him, 1 Chronicles 28:9. And you, my son Solomon, acknowledge the God of your father, and serve him with wholehearted devotion and with a willing mind. For the Lord searches every heart and understands every motive behind the thoughts. If you seek him, he will be found by you, but if you forsake him, he will reject you forever. Now, the first thing you see there is that God searches and sees motives. So let's not ever fool ourselves thinking that we're going to slide this one by him. because he's looking at it and he's going to see it and he's going to be able to ascertain whether or not we, like I did that day when I was trying to make myself look all like all that in a bag of chips, and in front of this guy, and he saw through it just as the Lord sees through our stuff. Second verse, Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 2. Proverbs 16:2 says this: all a man's ways seem innocent to him. Now you think about that. What that means is I'm operating out of true and pure motives. I mean, everything I do is selfless. I'm not doing this for anybody else. I'm not doing this thing for myself. I'm doing it for everybody else. I'm not thinking of myself at all. But notice what he says. All a man's ways seem innocent to him, but motives are weighed by the Lord. And when I was looking over that again this morning, I thought about this. I thought about Jesus in Matthew chapter 6. Remember when he said that there's some areas of our lives that we like to think that we have pure motives in, but we have anything but, and that's giving and praying and fasting. Remember, he talks about those three things, and we'll try to make ourselves look good when we're doing those things. And the reality is that our motives weren't all that pure after all. The last one is 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 5. 1 Corinthians 4:5. Here's what Paul wrote to the Corinthians. Therefore, judge nothing before the appointed time. Wait till the Lord comes. He will bring to light what is hidden in the darkness and will expose the motives of men's hearts. At that time, each will receive his praise from God. And so, then these three passages, we see that God searches and sees motives, God judges motives, and God will reveal motives in front of everyone. In front of everyone. So with all that in mind, let's look to the text of Philippians. Beginning with verse 7, let's read down through about verse 11. Paul wrote to them, and here's what he said. It is right for me to feel this way about you. Now, the thing he's talking about is what happened in the first 6 verses, the way he embraced them and felt good about them. He says, right for me to feel this way about all of you, since I have you in my heart. For whether I am in chains or defending and confirming the gospel, all of you share in God's grace with me. God can testify how I long for you all with the affection of Christ Jesus. And this is my prayer, that your love may abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight, so that you may be able to discern what is best and may be pure and blameless until the day of Christ, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ to the glory and praise of God. Now notice that Paul is talking about his feelings or his thoughts here about this group of folk. And he says everything is kind of based upon the fact that he esteems them in his heart. He feels so great about them. He has this unquestionable commitment to them. And we ask ourselves that kind of question, do I have an unquestionable commitment to someone? And he builds upon what he said about them in these preceding verses and how he prays for them. And he had this tremendously undeniable love for them. A love that had actually, I'm sure, had developed over a period of time, having served with them. And as he talks about this, he said, look, it doesn't really matter whether I'm in chains or whether I'm free to walk around and preach the gospel. You're right here with me. You're a part of this ministry. You're helping me to do what I'm doing, Paul says. He's likely in house arrest at this particular time, and so that's why he refers to himself as being in chains. But he says, I may be in that place, but I may be, as he says, defending and confirming the gospel. The word defending there is it's like an argument, apologetics, if you will, a discussion as to whether or not these things are true. And Paul says, I may be doing that. I may be out defending the gospel like that. Or I may be confirming the things that everyone knows and understands about the gospel. He has these great feelings about this group of individuals, and he said, as I'm doing this, you're right here with me. Here's the thing. Whenever I go and make a visit somewhere, in a home or a hospital or a nursing home, you all are there too. You're right in that moment, because you're making it possible for a person maybe with a gift of ministry to do that for other people, you're right there. When you go out and do this, you're doing for the church, everyone else is right there in that moment. That's what Paul says. When I'm doing this, the grace that I'm experiencing and expressing to other people, you're a part of that grace. That's what he writes to the Philippians. And that's how he thinks about them as partners in this. He talks about his longing for them and to be in their presence, to be with them and to share with them, but he can't. But he has this tremendous affection, the affection of Jesus Christ, that's so powerful and so special. Now, we've talked about this word again and again. The word that shows up there is affection. In the King James, it sometimes shows up as bowels of mercy. It actually is the word that describes the inner sac inside our bodies, which holds all the vital organs. It's called the nobler visceria. And it holds the heart and the liver and the kidney and the lungs and everything. And when that's used to describe this longing that Paul describes here, it's like, this is my gut feeling. This is the most important feeling I can have for another person. And that's what Paul is writing about. I have this intense affection of Christ for you. And then he starts talking about how he prays for them. He's praying that they will grow in love, which is a spiritually produced love. It's an achievement that we can't acquire or gain on our own. It's one of those things that the Spirit actually manufactures in our lives. Not only growth in love, but he says growth in knowledge and insight, what we should know about Jesus and what we should know about doctrinal matters. The depth of insight, what it means to be able to judge wisely, he says. He wants them to be able to observe and to think and to reason in a way that discerns the truth from falsehood. All kinds of spiritual matters. And he talks about this all throughout this letter. This isn't the only place. Growth in discernment of what is best, choosing between the right path or the wrong path or the path to one side as opposed to the other. All kinds of behavioral matters that come to the fore, come to rise up. He says, I want you to be pure and blameless and righteous. He wants them to bring glory to God through their lives. Now, as we think about ourselves in that regard, can we ask ourselves this question? Am I personally doing some of those things? Am I personally able to bring glory to God through the things that I say and do in the life that I live? That's what Paul wanted for the Thessalonians. I think that's what he would want for us as well. So if you're scorekeeping, the point is at the end, and here it is. Pure motives manifest themselves through concern for others. Pure motives manifest themselves through concern for others. And so, we can talk about that with regard to our own lives. Am I genuinely concerned about other people and their situations and what I can do for them and how I can help them and bless them? That's the kind of thing that the Apostle Paul saw for his own life as he wrote to the Philippians. Let's look at verse 12 and following. Now I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. Because of my chains, most of the brothers in the Lord have been encouraged to speak the word of God more courageously and fearlessly. Now, Paul's circumstance is easy pretty much to describe. We think he was under house arrest, most likely in Rome. We've referenced that already. It was important for the Philippians to know this and to understand this, to understand what his situation was and why it was so significant, what a role it played in everything. And notice what he says about it. He said, my imprisonment has actually served to advance the gospel. Now, I think about this sometimes. What really advances the gospel? We're the kind of people that we're always making plans, not just Shiva, I'm just talking about the human race in general. We're always making plans thinking that if we can make this plan and carry out this thing, then this will be the result. And there are scores, literally, I wouldn't even want to guess how many thousands of programs and workshops and everything else that takes place across the country every year and around the world every year in an effort to advance the gospel. None of that is wrong. It's not wrong to craft out a plan to try to advance the gospel. Let's really be clear about this. Those plans do not always work. Not only that, there are often times when the gospel is advanced when there were no plans, at least on our part. Many years ago, in that same first ministry that I was referenced at the beginning of this message, Janice and I had the occasion to go back to Atlanta to our alma mater for our alumni rally. And at that meeting, we were introduced to a gentleman that we had never seen before, but who had a profound impact on the rest of our ministerial lives. All kinds of stuff happened to us because of a kind of an inadvertent meeting of someone who was there that we'd never seen before. We didn't have that planned. I know the person didn't have that planned because he didn't know we were going to be there. Didn't know us from anyone else, basically. But God knew it. God was somehow in charge, working all that in advance. Now, we might be called to make plans, but be prepared to have those plans altered by the will of God from time to time. Paul, in these chains, said it was clear to everyone around him there in the palace why he was there. They saw him there. They understood why he was there. He wasn't like the average criminal who had been arrested for insurrection or, doing something against the government or murder or theft or anything. He was there because he was preaching for the cause of the kingdom. It was for the sake of Christ, he says, that he's been put in this situation. You can read all about that if you want to from time to time in Acts chapters 20 through 28. We won't go into all that now. But his chains were evidence to all that there was something special about what he was doing. Now, as we think about those, we also think about his influence. Paul says, look, by virtue of what has happened to me, a lot of people have been encouraged. I want to point out something. I don't know if you caught this or not. Many of you did, but 2 weeks ago when Brother C.Y. was here along with his wife Patricia, when they were here, there was a lot of buzz in the church right after that. There was a lot of buzz in the church about the things that this family had endured throughout their years of ministry. There was a lot of buzz about, I just thought I had trouble. There was a lot of buzz about that kind of stuff. And so it's one of those things where maybe, just maybe, that some of us were encouraged to do a little more, do a little better, do a little different than we ever had before because of what someone else had experienced in ministry. That's exactly what Paul was talking about here. He said, because of what's happened to me, because of my being thrown in jail, there's been some people that have really, we refer to it as stepping up to the plate. Stepping up to the plate. Before, I would never even thought about that. Many years ago in one of my ministries, the church was sponsoring doing what we called a miracle offering. We were going to try to raise $100,000 for a special building program. And there was one gentleman in the church made a very sizable donation to that, very sizable. And his comment was, after he had done this, was not, everybody look at me. His comment was this: I would never in my wildest dreams imagined I would have ever have done something like that. But so motivated, so encouraged by virtue of the fact that what was taking place, I want to do this great thing, if you will. And that's kind of the way the Apostle Paul was in this whole process here. John Maxwell, as we've said, I've mentioned this before, he says, we teach what we know, but we reproduce who we are. And that is exactly what was happening here. And so people were encouraged to share the gospel more effectively, more aggressively than they ever had before, both the Philippians and people since who have read these words. So again, if you're keeping score, this is our second point of the day, and that is this. Pure motives manifest themselves in the desire for spiritual growth to be the end result. When it's our desire to see other people come to know Jesus and to grow in that faith, then all kinds of things are possible, but certainly those are our purest of motives, if you will. All right, let's bring this thing home now with these last few verses we have. Let's begin with verse 15 and read through verse 18. It is true. I need a pause here. You've heard me say this before. Some of you even smiling. Perhaps you remember it. Janice knows where this is going. If I could cut anything in the Bible out of the Bible, if I could cut anything that's in out, these are the verses I would cut out. Now, I'll just tell you up front, and I'll explain to you why in just a moment, okay? But notice what Paul says. It is true, some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter, that is the goodwill folk, the latter do so in love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former, that is the impure motive folk, preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing they can stir up trouble for me while I'm in chains. But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice, yes, and will continue to rejoice. Now, did you catch what he's saying there? There's some bad motives out there. There's some false motives. There's some impure motives. Those folks aren't doing what they ought to do, but that's okay. What? What, Paul? I didn't hear that really. Because I'm a firm believer in true and pure motives, and I know all of you are too. But when you read this and you see Paul says well, it really doesn't matter. What? Well, let's look at it and we'll see why it does it. Why Paul said it the way he said it. He makes an observation here that some people are insincere in their motives. They preach for the wrong reasons. Maybe they preach out of envy. In other words, they want what someone else has. They don't like the fact that someone else is getting attention, maybe getting paid or getting something else. Who knows? But they're envious of it. And so let's go after that. I won't tell you where this happened, but many years ago there was a preacher who told the story of when he was young. He was asked by a congregation to come and fill in for them when the minister was away. Now, this was back, probably 60, 70 years ago when churches didn't pay a lot of money for people to do the kind of thing like that. So he went and preached. He was only like 15, 16. He goes and preaches for this church, and they gave him $25, and someone took him home to a chicken dinner. And he told from the pulpit that he said, when that happened, they gave me $25, and they took me home for a chicken dinner. He said, "This is it. If that's how they treat preachers, that's what I want to be." No, well, I like chicken too. But if that's the main motive, I'm not sure that's getting it done necessarily. But he says some people have envy, and some people maybe even rivalry. Paul says there are actually people that will stir up trouble from time to time. The word rivalry has the idea of discord and dissension. He said, these are the observations I'm making, Paul says. Some people have impure motives, but some have sincere motives. He refers to them as preaching out of goodwill. And the word sincere, I know I've shared this with you. I've shared it with my Sunday school class a couple of times. The word sincere is a Latin word. It comes from the two words sin, S-I-N, in Latin, and it means without, and cera, which means wax. It means without wax. Now, you think, what does that have to do with anything? Well, in the day and time when Paul was writing this, it was a very common practice for Roman sculptors when they were sculpting a piece. If they had something that chipped out that they didn't intend to, they would melt wax and put it in the spot. And it would blend in and you couldn't really tell it. The only time you could tell it was when it got warm and the wax started to melt and run out. And so the word literally means without wax, sincere, without any kind of contamination. It's the real McCoy, in other words. And Paul says that's the way some people are preaching like that. And so he comes to this conclusion that these sincere folk, they know who I am and they know what I'm trying to do. And they love my ministry and they're trying to support that ministry and with their own preaching and teaching, which is a great thing. But the insincere folks, the folks who preach out of envy and rivalry, he says they're trying to stir up all kind of trouble. They're trying to make things more difficult for me and for the gospel. They're filled with selfish ambition, if you will. And so, as he writes that, here's a conclusion that Paul comes to about himself. And you see if you don't find this here. It was a temptation then for Paul to believe that everyone will operate with godly or pure motives. Now, isn't that true of us? Isn't it true of us that we kind of figure that everybody has pure motives that preaches the gospel, or everybody has something true about them, at least initially until we learn differently. But we think that anybody that's doing that's got to be doing it for the right reasons, and it's a great temptation to think that. The Apostle Paul was able to see through that. And so he's trying to back away from judging them in that regard. But here was a greater temptation that he faced. And he comes through with flying colors because he did much better at it than I did at it. Because remember, I said I would cut this passage out if it were me. Because I like for people to have pure motives. The Apostle Paul was under the temptation not to rejoice when that gospel was being presented, even if it was being presented by someone who was insincere. He said, look, it doesn't matter. It's a shame that everyone can't be sincere, but the advancement of the gospel is what matters, not whether there's sincerity always on behalf of the one who's preaching. And that just sounds so terrible to say almost, but that's what he says. Look, it's important, more important for the gospel to be out there because the gospel itself will change people, not the preacher. I've never converted anyone in my entire life, and neither has any other preacher. We share the Word. The Word through the Spirit the work is done. That's where it happens. And the Apostle Paul knew that. And so I give him kudos for that. And so if you're keeping score again, the last point of all this is what we just said. Pure motives manifest themselves by refraining from judging the motives of others. Boy, that is really tough. And that is especially true when we talk about judging others in the arena of evangelism or reaching people for Christ. Let me throw this one out at you. Are we ever critical of other churches or other ministries or other preachers or church members suggesting that their motives are impure or worldly while ours are completely pure and without any blemish? You ever done that? You don't have to raise your hand, because if you're anything like me, if you're just 1/10 like me, you've done it many times. Because it's a temptation that we often can't overcome, because we realize from time to time that somebody else doesn't have pure motives here. And so what does all this mean for us? Well, it means a great deal, and it certainly means a matter of if you want to have real joy in your life, the best way to have real joy is to make certain that your motives are just as pure as they can possibly be, that they're true to the calling. And so let me give you a few questions to ask of yourselves, as I've asked of myself regarding this. To ascertain our true motive or motives in a given situation, it'd be wise to ask some of the following questions and give ourselves an honest reply, because anything less is hypocritical. Okay, so here's some. Ask ourselves, why am I planning this? Why am I planning on doing this? Is this emanating for something, desire to help someone else, or is this all about me? Now, I'm not suggesting that it's never a time to have something about us, but maybe we need to ask ourselves that question. What is the reason behind my doing this or that thing? Do I have a pure motive or some kind of ulterior motive? Why did I say yes or no in a given situation? Was it all about me, or was there, were there some true motives here? Just what is, or what are our true motive or motives? I think about what the Apostle Paul wrote in those verses, and he is trying to make sense of what it means to preach the gospel in the worst adverse situations you could possibly think of, and that of being imprisoned and having your freedom taken away from you. And at the same time, still trying to minister to scores of people in various churches through his writings and everything else. It's a tough deal, isn't it? And then he comes to this whole thing about motive. And what do we do with it? Well, the only thing I can suggest to us this morning is that we allow the Spirit of Christ to dwell in us richly, as Paul wrote in Colossians 3. Let the Spirit of Christ dwell in you richly, so all these good things will be produced. And no one else can look from the outside to the inside and see that except God. And He will reveal it if we'll allow Him. But if you're here today and you've never responded to the love and the grace and the mercy that God has in store for you as His child, we're going to give you that opportunity to do that, to allow Christ to do this work in you that He's promised when we repent and we confess and when we're immersed into Him and when we walk in the newness of life. That's what He's promised. But for many, the rest of us, and I know it's important for us to think about how we operate with true motives. Just a little self-examination here to make certain that we experience joy at its ultimate sense because our motives are pure. Whatever your need happens to be today, we're going to invite you to come as we stand and sing. Stand up. Stand up for Jesus.